Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, part of the Philosophy Annual Ethics Lecture Series, The Injustices of Girlism, Childhood Pregnancy and Abortion in America, with Dr. Kimberley Brownlee. And now, to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from Fourth Space, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. At Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge. We co-create daily activities that examine research questions, projects, things happening across the university. We're also running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting. So those of you joining us there, we welcome your comments, your questions. Please add those into the chat and we'll do our best to read those out during the Q&A period. For those of you here in the space, kind of the same thing. If you have any questions later on, just raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone over to you so that everyone can hear. To help start us off and get things going, it is my pleasure to pass the microphone over to the chair and professor in the Department of Philosophy, David Morris. David, good to have you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to
Just talking to your mic there, David.
Oh, sorry. Thanks to all who have joined us in this room, in person, and those online. It's a very great pleasure to introduce this particular installment in our lecture series. It's a special one, so can I get the slides up there? Yes, thank you. So we've already heard the name of the talk today, and also our guest, Dr. Kimberley Brownlee, who's the Canada Research Chair in Ethics and Political and Social Philosophy at the University of British Columbia, who's flown across our vast country to join us today to give this talk. It is a special talk because it is part of a series. It's the third in a series that began in 2022-23, whether by coincidence or design. All of our guests, including Professor Brownlee, are CRC chairs in ethics and political philosophy and related areas at the universities. So our first one was from Chike Jeffers, who is a CRC at Dalhousie, with a talk on elegant responses, ethical and political themes in ancient Egyptian literature. And last year we had Professor Monique DeVoe, who's a CRC at Guelph University, joining us with a talk on rethinking structural exploitation, temporary migrant workers, and state-conditioned vulnerability. And I think you can see that we're getting a very exciting set of philosophers talking on very up-to-date and important themes and old and important themes. And at this point in the lecture, I would like to acknowledge that this is a series that was initiated through donations from Dr. Wanda Tays, who is now Professor Emerita at Mount St. Mary's University in Los Angeles. This is a sample of some of the covers of books she's written or edited, who she has connections with the themes of many of these talks. But this is our 50th anniversary at Concordia. And those of you who are at the presentation about the history of the department will have seen the Violence Against Women volume that is co-edited by Stanley French and Wanda Tays back when Professor Tays was a humanities PhD student here. And I wanted to mention that on this occasion of the 50th anniversary, because in fact, Professor Tays is the first graduate of the humanities PhD here. She was supervised by Professor French, who was the chair of the philosophy department at the time. And this is a scan of her dissertation cover, June 1980. It's a thesis on naming the unnameable, on language and silence in Beckett's novel. And I've read through some interesting portions of this. Significantly, it's working on Beckett's novel, The Unnameable, in terms of theories of philosophy of language found in logical atomism, the later Wittgenstein, and Heidegger, which I think you can see is a kind of topic that's a little bit resonant with the department today. I wanted to draw this to our attention as part of our thanks to Professor Tays for sponsoring the lecture series and for making this possible. And now for the third installment, for the lecture itself and for our guest, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Anna, who has orchestrated this particular instance of the lecture series and will introduce things further. So thanks very much for your time and your attendance, and here we go.
Hi everyone, I'm going to be very quick so we can get on to the main part of the show. Thank you for being here, both in person and online. I just want to officially introduce Dr. Kimberley Brownlee, who is going to be our speaker for today. As David mentioned, she holds the Canada Research Chair in Ethics and Social and Political Philosophy at the University of British Columbia. She has numerous very lovely publications in a wide variety of prestigious venues that too long to name. But her current work focuses on loneliness, belonging, freedom of association, and social human rights. So with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Brownlee.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna and David, for the invitation to be here, and thanks to Professor Tays for the funding to return to Montreal to give this lecture. I did my undergraduate degree at McGill, and so I have a very soft spot for Montreal, and it's such a treat to be back. And this is the first lecture I've given in Montreal since I was an undergraduate. So I don't know if I would have, when I was an undergrad, seen myself here at that point. So it's a pleasure to have lived out a dream to become a philosopher. The paper that this lecture is based on is one of those where I felt I needed to write it. There's some topics that feel urgent, that won't leave you alone. And for me, this was one of those topics. And I've conducted the work behind this lecture with one of my doctoral students, Alyssa, Izatt, and indeed she is the lead author on the first paper we've written on this topic. My topic is a difficult one, right? The idea of pregnancy in childhood, the idea of having an abortion during childhood. But it's a topic that always has mattered, but matters even more now that the United States has issued its judgment in Dobbs in 2022, which overturned a 50-year precedent recognized in the US as a constitutional right to access abortion care. So that was Roe v. Wade, and Dobbs undid that constitutional recognition that had stood for 50 years. Many US states had bans ready to go that were triggered by the Dobbs judgment. So very soon after that judgment, multiple US states banned abortion, and many severely restricted it. So after 6 weeks, you could not access an abortion. 21 US states either banned or severely restricted it. There are many legal cases ongoing. This is unsettled territory. There have been many state referenda on these issues. The majority have resulted in protections of abortion within state constitutions, but in about half the US population presently lives under severely restrictive abortion laws or a ban. Now this irregular checkerboard, that's Ronald Dworkin's term, that if Roe v. Wade was overturned, there would be an irregular checkerboard where in some parts of the US, people could access abortion care easily, in other parts not. I don't know if that irregular checkerboard is going to stay in place for very long. The United States government has just shut down its website with information related to abortion. People who are opposed to abortion are becoming more confident that they can achieve a federal position. So we may see the situation become far worse very soon. The US is a country that has the muscle to have its norms become those norms internationally. We've just seen over the past 2 weeks the effect of the US making changes about its own position and the ripple that has around the world. Internationally, there are at least 24 countries that ban abortion, and many countries that permit it very restrictively. And the Center for Reproductive Rights estimates that 40% of the people who could become pregnant live under extremely restrictive abortion laws. So in this context, we tend to think of this as a women's issue, right? The people being targeted by restrictive laws are women, and that's an important part of this story. It's an enormous injustice. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, these organizations reacted loudly to the Dobbs judgment that this was a breach of human rights. The right to control your own body, the right to set the course of your life, the right to decide how many children you will have. But the story about women is not the full story. And the story about girls is subsumed, usually, under the story about women. Many feminists speak of women and girls in the same breath. But women are not, they are one category. Girls are another distinct category of people affected. And my aim in this talk is to entertain the question, what do we owe to an impregnated girl as a girl? What do doctors owe to such a child? What do parents, nurses, judges, the state, what duties do they have to a child who has been impregnated? And I use that language of impregnation deliberately. Someone who is a child is often very ill-informed. Someone who is a child who becomes pregnant has had this done to her by someone. Someone has done this to her. And that language of being impregnated does need to stay at the front of our minds when we talk about the right way to respond to her situation. Now, I want to talk about a few cases, US cases, that came into the news soon after the Dobbs judgment because they give a vivid context for the situation we're considering. So in the same month that Dobbs was passed, a 9-year-old girl in Ohio, her family and her doctor discovered that she had been impregnated, that she had been raped by a 27-year-old man named Gerson Fuentes. He had confessed to that, and she needed an abortion. But Ohio had just banned abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy, and she was 6 weeks and 3 days pregnant. So her doctor referred her to an Indiana OBGYN, Dr. Caitlin Bernard. At that point, Indiana had not banned abortion after 6 weeks. So Dr. Bernard provided a medication abortion. And she faced an immediate backlash when she spoke to an Indiana newspaper about it. She protected her patient's anonymity, but the very fact she flagged that such a case had occurred resulted in her having to get 24-hour security. The two states subsequently flipped their positions. In August of 2023, Indiana instituted a near total ban. And in November of 2023, Ohio held a state referendum which enshrined Roe-era protections in the Constitution. So basically prohibiting abortion only after fetal viability. So that's one US case. So the little girl was 9 when she was raped. She was 10 when she had the abortion. Another case from 2022 is in Florida. Here, a judge ruled that a 16-year-old girl was not sufficiently mature to consent to an abortion, even with her guardian's permission. There's a perverse implication in that despite her being too immature to consent to an abortion, she was somehow sufficiently mature to carry a pregnancy to term and then possibly mother a baby. An even more perverse implication of that ruling was that if a 16-year-old is too immature to consent to an abortion, then a 10-year-old, like the girl from Ohio, was certainly too immature to consent to an abortion. Now, what's been really striking in reading about those cases, in reacting to the Dobbs judgment, in trying to get a sense of how doctors try to navigate this territory, is to find that there are few clear clinical guidelines for doctors, and the guidelines that are there vary widely. So many guidelines treat impregnated children in the same way as pregnant women. So doctors are given the same kinds of advice for those cases. In some states, in the states that ban abortion, there is no exception made for children. And indeed, some of the states that have bans, the language they use defines a woman to be any human being with a uterus. So any child, any trans man, any newborn baby who is female is a woman in this legislation. The states that are more permissive, sort of support a woman's right to choose, they also do not clearly distinguish girls from women, and they advise doctors to tell a patient about all three options: abortion, adoption, or indeed mothering a baby. In addition to there being very few clear clinical guidelines, certainly for children, there are also very few philosophical analyses in this area. And this was striking, right? That feminist philosophy has not singled out the distinctive injustices endured by girls. That there's a specific intersection, being a child and being female, that makes you vulnerable to specific types of injustice. And so my doctoral students, Alyssa, Izatt, and I, we've put branding on this injustice. We've labeled it girlism. And girlism is not a perfect term. If you want to ask me in the Q&A why it's not perfect, I'm very happy to tell you. It's sort of the term, it was the best term we could land on to try to capture the injustice that sits at that intersection of childhood and, in this case, female embodiment. Abortion and pregnancy is about female embodiment. We want to allow that the concept of girlism can capture a broader notion of a girl, that it could relate to gender identity, gender presentation, but for the purposes of this work, it relates to female embodiment. Now, not only is there not a good set of analyses of the injustices of girlism, there's also something to be noticed about that lack of analysis. So Miranda Fricker has written an excellent book, Epistemic Injustice. She's launched a subfield on epistemic injustice. And one of the types of injustice she identifies is what she calls hermeneutical injustice. And the idea here is that if a set of people do not have a language to describe their experiences, if they don't have the power of definition, if they are not in charge of the concepts that are in circulation, they can't find each other. They can't advocate together. They can't even clearly describe what they've experienced. And so the fact we don't have a good term and a good analysis for girls' experiences of injustice, that's a hermeneutical injustice. And this is a group that is not well placed to articulate their own experience of injustice. They need others, adults, right? They need scholars to put language on their experience of injustice. So with that as background, the central thesis I want to defend today is that both opponents of abortion and liberal defenders of abortion make a mistake when it comes to children. Opponents of abortion, even if we wanted to grant that that view could be correct in relation to adult women, they would be wrong to extend their opposition to the case of impregnated children. Those who support a woman's right to control her own body, let's grant that that position is right, they are mistaken to extend that right to choose to a child. Both of these groups forget that this is a child. And so we argue for, Alyssa and I defend a view that some people find absolutely straightforward and uncontentious, and other people find quite off-putting, we argue that physicians, guardians, all adults responsible for an impregnated child's care have a duty to view this as a malady to be treated and to provide abortion care. Okay, so my plan to defend that thesis is as follows. First, I will try and specify who is a child. This is surprisingly difficult. I also say briefly who we take to be a girl in this context. I'll then say a bit more about this concept of girlism, which we're developing, and then I'm going to offer an analogy between pregnancy and childhood and living child organ donation. What is very striking is that in the context of living child organ donation, there are tight protocols. There are strict limits on who may be a donor. In most jurisdictions, a person has to be 18. In British Columbia, it's 19 to be a donor. In some places, a 16 or 17-year-old is permitted to be a donor, but only for very limited types of donations. Any tissue that's not going to regrow itself, that's not a type of donation a 16 or 17-year-old could make. And there are good arguments for these restrictions, these protections. And the presence of these restrictions is very striking when considered alongside the haphazard guidelines for a patient, a child who is pregnant. So we're going to use that analogy to argue for a set of criteria for permitting a child to continue in gestation, and we'll show that it results in recommending a uniform protocol to provide abortion care. Okay, so who is a child? There are many ways we could try and get a grip on who is a child. We could offer a biological prepubescent conception. So any human being is a child if they have not yet undergone puberty. We could offer a cognitive competence conception. So a human being is a child provided they are not displaying competent decision-making capacities, the level of responsibility that we expect of adults. We could take a neurological conception. A human being is a child if their brain has not fully developed. The brain continues to develop until about the age of 25. We could take an age-based conception. This is what the United Nations does in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. They say, for the purposes of the present convention, a child is every human being below the age of 18 years unless, under the law applicable to that child, majority is attained earlier. And that's a sort of striking concession. And then finally, we could take a legal conception that a child is whoever our state decides will be a child. Now, there are problems with each of these conceptions. The biological prepubescent conception is problematic because it's both under-inclusive and over-inclusive. So the youngest person on record to give birth was a little girl named Lena Medina, and she was 5. The youngest person in the United States to give birth was a girl named Estelle, and she started to menstruate when she was 1, and she gave birth when she was 9. The little girl in Ohio would not be a child for the purposes of that conception because she'd given birth. So in a way, the people we're most keen to protect in this discussion could not be children if we took puberty as the marker of when you become an adult. It also would exclude people whose bodies don't undergo puberty, perhaps at all, or at sort of roughly the age where we think someone is attaining majority. They would still be children, even though they might be leading full adult lives. The cognitive competence conception is problematic because a very prodigiously competent youngster would have to be deemed an adult. Someone who is displaying remarkable decision-making capacity, remarkable responsibility would have to be deemed an adult. Equally, someone who's severely cognitively impaired would have to be deemed a child, regardless of their age. The neurological conception is problematic because if the brain keeps growing until the age of 25, that would mean a lot of people we believe are adults must be deemed to be children. So, and in a way, we might sort of say, that seems a bit of an arbitrary marker, sort of changes in the brain as such. The age-based conception is problematic because, just as night shifts in today and we pick an arbitrary point to draw the line, so too with age. Why should we say your 18th birthday is the moment you become an adult? If there were such a moment, it would not be the same time for everyone. And pointing to that moment, why not the day before? Why not 6 months before? Why not 2 years later? The legal conception is problematic because to the extent it relies on any of the other conceptions, it inherits their difficulties. And it's also problematic when you look at the law on the books, that laws tend to deem a person to be an adult in some domains, but not others. So within a given jurisdiction, you could be not allowed to drink until you're 21, but allowed to vote at 16 or 18, and held criminally liable at 10. So we have some problems. Maybe if you have a better conception, I would be grateful to hear it. But what I take away from this is that we shouldn't actually try to land on a tight definition. We should offer a paradigm case. So paradigmatically, a child is a comparatively young human being who has lived, for example, perhaps less than 1/5 of an average human life. So that would be about 18 years. So we may roughly land on that age-based conception, but we're not doing it in a hard and fast definitional way, but just paradigmatically, that is a child. And what's crucial here is that a child, every child, is entitled to a certain number of years of protected life, protected from the responsibilities of adulthood. And they deserve that protection regardless of their competence, their brain development, whether they've gone through puberty. Every child has basically a right to a childhood. Now, the goods that are protected by that right to a childhood, they start with this one I've just referenced of being burden-free, being care-free. So we can understand carefreeness to mean artless, uninhibited, buoyant. We associate joyfulness with childhood. But it's also just simply being free of having to make life and death decisions, being free of care duties, being free of the burdens that go with adulthood. And that first good is the good that makes those other goods available, right? So having the leisure to engage in artistic creativity, to think philosophically and be open-minded, to seek friendship, to be playful, these are skills that children are particularly good at. Anke Gausch has written some papers on the distinctive goods of childhood and the distinctive talents of children. But exercising those talents, being philosophically curious, that depends on being burden-free. Now, with that brief specification of a paradigm case of a child, we need within that group to understand who is a girl. And as I say, for the purposes of this project, I will understand a girl to be a female child, but that is specifically for the purposes of this project, because we're talking about the body. Now, I'll just flag that the reason we've used this term girlism is to sort of bring to mind other types of injustice that we have branded with an ism, right? Racism, speciesism, anti-Semitism. We use isms to pick out specific types of injustice. And so this, we want to be able to flag that there are certain types of wrongs that are going to be exacerbated when they are girlist, when they are done to someone who is a child and they're done because she's female, or these are wrongs that could only be done to someone who is female. Okay, now it's worth being aware that pregnancy in childhood is not as rare as we might think. It's certainly not as rare as we might hope. The statistics from the United States from 2022, close to 2,000 girls between the ages of 10 and 14 gave birth, and there were over 1,300 abortions performed on that demographic. Those numbers are actually incorrect. They're too low because California, Maryland, a few other big states did not provide their data. So those numbers are certainly higher. For 15 to 19-year-olds in 2022, 35,000 births for girls 15 to 17, and over 143,000 births for 15 to 19. So this happens a lot. And that's the United States. And again, those numbers are too low because California, Maryland, other states didn't contribute data. UNICEF reports that an estimated 14% of girls give birth before they're 18. Now, what's striking is that UNICEF's reporting refers to this as early childbearing and refers to these people as women, basically forgetting its own definition, the UN's own definition of who is a child, right? So lumping 15, 16, 17, 18 in with 19, they're disregarding their own definition of a child in referring to these people as early childbearers or indeed as women aged 15 to 19. And that reference is telling because what it suggests is that pregnancy is a transformatively maturing event, that someone who was a child until they were impregnated becomes a woman as a result of gestation and then confronting the responsibility of mothering. But what's far more likely, and I'm going to provide some data to support it, is that gestation, giving birth, and then mothering is a transformatively stunting event when undertaken during childhood. And here's some indicators as to why. So someone who experiences pregnancy in childhood, it's far, far more likely to be a high-risk pregnancy. So far greater risk of preeclampsia, anemia, rupture of the fetal membrane, neonatal death, so death of the fetus or death of the baby after birth, death of the mother. Sorry, I don't want to use that language. Death of the child who was pregnant. Far greater risk of birth complications, about twice the level of risk if you're a child than if you're an adult. And a lot of concomitant risks related to socioeconomic position. So much higher rates of depression. Girls who have gone through pregnancy are twice as likely to be depressed as their age group peers. If you have a pregnancy in adolescence, you're more likely to have more pregnancies, so more rapid and frequent pregnancies, so more children overall, more children close together, lower levels of education, higher risk of poverty, higher rates of drug use. It is an extremely difficult life, right, if this is someone's experience. And then there's some very new research that indicates that if you have gone through a pregnancy in childhood, you have a higher risk of dying in your 30s, that your life is shortened. That there's a correlation between pregnancy and adolescence and dying young as an adult. So that's a little bit of the context and the background and why this really deserves its own analysis. And part of undertaking that analysis means holding philosophers to account for when they have run roughshod over the fact that this is a girl. So Derek Parfit has a famous case in his book, Reasons and Persons, about the 14-year-old girl. And the case relates to what's called the non-identity problem and the question of whether we can hold someone to account for giving someone a bad start in life when if she'd waited and had a child later, it would have been a different person who came into existence. But the way this case is treated, so first Parfit sets it up as, we tried to convince this child, so he says girl, we tried to convince this girl not to have a child now, to wait until she's more responsible, better able to be a mother. And she replies, well, this is my affair. And I have a right to do what I want. And Parfit then characterizes her decision. She gives birth, the child gets a bad start. He characterizes this as her fault. Right? And specifically as a consequence of her poor decision-making. But what's going on there is Parfit's engaging in a warped form of adultification. That's one type of girlism. It's not the only type. But one type of girlism is to treat this girl as if she's a woman, to hold her account as a woman, even though the key piece of the story is that the reason she's reasoning badly is because she's not an adult. She is a child. Actually, I'll just say, whoops, sorry. I just want to say one more thing about that case. This is my affair line. If the case had been about some other affair, critics and commentators on Parfit would have spotted its implausibility. So if the 14-year-old, if what was at issue was, I want to adopt, or I want to seek IVF treatment, or even I want to leave school, I want to buy my own house, I want to fly to another country, I want to legally emancipate myself. There's so many things a 14-year-old is not permitted to do. Commentators would have noticed the implausibility of this case, but we seem to have a blind spot in relation to pregnancy and adultify children who are enduring it. Okay, now one final thing about girlism before we get to the analogy with child donation. There's an important body of work on what's called intersectionality. I've identified one intersection, the intersection of childhood and girlhood, or female embodiment. But many girls have other intersections complicating their experience, notably girls of color, Black girls. And this is another US case. This is from Mississippi. So the name's been changed. But a little girl in the magazine article, she's given the name Ashley. In 2023, she was playing in her family's front yard, and a strange man, came by and raped her. And as a result, she became pregnant. She was too scared and ashamed that she didn't tell her family she had been raped. She started to vomit. Her mom took her to the hospital, and they found out that she was 10 weeks pregnant. Mississippi and every surrounding state had enacted an abortion ban. The nearest abortion clinic was in Chicago. Her mom could not afford to take the time off work to drive her there. She didn't get an abortion. And so before she started grade 7, she gave birth. And that situation, not having the resources, not being able to take time off work, not being able to access the right form of support, get medical care, that is far more often the experience of girls of color than Caucasian. Okay, so let's turn to this analogy with living child organ donation. So let's have another sort of model. Suppose we have a 14-year-old who wishes to save her 3-year-old sister. Right? She wants to provide a life-saving organ. She wants to do something analogous, right, to gestating, to secure the life of another being. In most jurisdictions, in the US, the UK, Canada, Europe, most Western democracies, she would not be permitted. Her physicians would not be permitted to let her, and certainly nobody would be allowed to compel her to provide an organ. And as I flagged already, in most jurisdictions, a donor must be at least 18 and there are some exceptions made for minor donations for people over 16. But certain conditions have to be met for the 18-year-old, for the 16-year-old. The first condition is that this is a last resort. To ask a 16-year-old to be a donor, adult donor options must have been exhausted. Cadaver donor options must be unavailable. This has to be the last possible option to recruit a child or to permit a child to donate. Second, the donation must cause minimal risk to the donating child, 16-year-old. If by child you're hearing 12, that's not 14, that's not the case. It's, you have a 16-year-old in mind at the moment. It must cause minimal risk to that 16-year-old. And if it looks like it will be risky, then doctors may not proceed. The young person must also not be coerced and not be manipulated, and this means there must be an independent donor advocate who confirms, separately from the family, that this child is not coerced, not manipulated. They do this willingly. They understand, what they're doing, why they're doing it, and they want it. And then finally, the donor child's own best interest must be served. So they can only donate, a 16-year-old can only donate to a close family member, perhaps their own caregiver, right? That they will benefit, they will enjoy the ongoing relationship with this person. That parent being saved will maybe relieve financial pressure, and the child will benefit from the financial security. So all of these factors, these are each deal breakers, right? If any of these conditions is not met, the donation does not proceed, even though someone may lose their life as a result. And the reasoning behind it is very solid, right? That children have a right to be safe, to be secure, to be protected from exploitation. They have a right to develop healthily. They have a right to be burden-free, not to be burdened with the responsibilities of adulthood. And so these limits, these tight restrictions on donation protect young people from having to, from either being permitted or certainly being compelled to carry heavy burdens, to risk themselves for someone else. And so Alyssa and I argue that mutatis mutandis, meaning with a few adjustments, those arguments apply to the case of an impregnated child. So one of the conditions does not apply, and that's the last resort condition, right? The child has already been burdened. It's not a question. She's already in the position of having to confront the fact she's been burdened. The other three conditions, though, right? Minimal risk, non-coercion, her own best interests, those apply, and they support the idea that doctors and guardians should view a pregnancy as a malady to be treated. Because when you explore these conditions, we find that these tests in combination will not be met. So minimal risk it's just not the case that pregnancy in childhood is a minimally risky undertaking. Pregnancy in general is not a low-risk enterprise. It is a risky thing to become pregnant. And then all the details I gave about the greater risk, both comparative and absolute, the great risk of carrying a pregnancy to term in childhood shows that the minimal risk condition will be the one that, the bar that probably cannot be passed. The best interest condition, again, looking forward for a child who has been impregnated, higher risk of poverty, higher risk of repeated pregnancies, higher risk of dropping out of school, her future well-being is being compromised. So I flagged before that it's striking that there are tight protocols in the case of donation and a very haphazard approach in the case of pregnancy. And indeed, in states with bans, there's no accommodation made for how young the pregnant person is. And this is, I believe, a type of girlism, that very discrepancy, because both boys and girls, all young people, can be donors. Only female-embodied people can become pregnant. So those are the three tests that doctors should attend to. And as I say, when they work together, they will lead to a protocol that the adequate care for an impregnated child includes abortion care. Now, what about a child's preferences, right? So if you've kind of followed me to this point, some may think, yes, this is right. But some of you might be thinking, oof, okay, right, are we going to mandate an abortion for a 16-year-old, or 15-year-old, 14-year-old? Is that the conclusion? For the 14-year-old and the 15-year-old, yes, that is the conclusion. And I want to try and say a few things to make that conclusion palatable. So a critic might understandably balk at the contention that physicians have a duty to provide an abortion when a child has adverse preferences or indeed has an aversion to the procedure. Now, the way to support this is to look to other areas of medicine where doctors know that they have a duty to proceed even if a child is unwilling to acquiesce to treatment. So certainly for younger children, any parent knows you can be asked to hold your child tightly, right? So they receive a vaccination, so they have blood taken. That their unwillingness is not a good enough reason for doctors not to provide adequate care, right? In the cases of cancer treatment, other types of life-saving treatment, life-altering treatment, physicians will use physical restraints, they will use anesthetics, they will do what they need to do to provide the care they have a duty to provide, even if the child has adverse preferences. So you don't deny that the treatment can sometimes be unpleasant or upsetting, but that does not excuse adult caregivers from providing what they have a duty to provide. Now, suppose a child is given an abortion, is given a medication abortion, is given a pill, results in termination of pregnancy, and there's a risk that in the future she will regret this, she will resent this. Does that future regret, that impact on her future well-being, is that a good reason not to provide abortion care? So what we need to focus on here is that it's important a child not resent herself, right? So a child who is encouraged to continue a pregnancy or who is required to continue a pregnancy, she might well regret and resent that in future. She might regret being at the edge of poverty, regret her loss of education, regret multiple pregnancies, regret her overall situation, and then be in the very difficult position that socially you're not allowed to say you regret being a mother. She might well wish that her adult caregivers had taken charge of this for her, right? That she was impregnated, someone did this to her when she was young. She should not have had the burden of deciding what would happen or indeed of being forced to gestate. So if she is going to resent or regret the provision of abortion, it is better that she resent her caregivers than that she resent her child's self. Now, a critic might say, well, that story, that it's better that she resent her caregivers, actually can be an argument for continuing gestation. That it'd be better that she resent her caregivers for encouraging her or requiring her to gestate than that she regret or resent herself. But that line of argument has to be made within a particular worldview, a particular religious worldview that is at odds with doctors' responsibilities to their patients. Right? That a doctor who's attending to the best interests of their patient will not let a child's concern, a child's potential future resentment about gestating be what determines whether they provide abortion care. Okay, so what I've sought to do in this paper is to sort of grapple for myself with one of the implications of Dobbs, the impact on children, and I see that impact is only going to get worse, right? The way the Trump government looks to be going, this is going to affect so many more people. I've sought to identify a term to label a type of injustice, girlism. I've used that notion of girlism to separate girls' experience of pregnancy out from this broader women's issue. And I've offered this analogy with living child organ donation to show why doctors have a duty to provide abortion care. That to recruit someone or even permit someone to save someone else, a very tight set of conditions must be met. Last resort in the case of child donation, and for the other, for both cases, being uncoerced, facing minimal risk, and this being in the child's best interest. And in the case of child impregnation, those conditions will in all probability not be met. And we have no justification for sacrificing a child's interest for the sake of another or a potential other. Okay, thank you very much.
So now we have about an hour for Q&A.
Do you mind fielding? My vision's very poor. Thank you. I can see the front row and that's it.
So for us, we just request that anyone in the audience raise their hands like that and we will get a microphone to you. So no worries.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. That really was super interesting, and I have to admit I didn't realize how empirically important it is. Like, I was very not just shocked, but also surprised at these numbers. I wouldn't have thought that. I really, when I read the abstract, considered it more of a, well, not an entirely unapplied, but a somewhat, to some extent, theoretical question. I really have to shamefully admit. I entirely agree with your assessment of the situation. And I think this comparison with like organ donations is very interesting because you can make a similar case where you also have the well-being of two children to compare. Like if you have a sibling donor who's also underage. So you have the sibling that could donate, you have the sibling who either receives the transplant or dies, and both of them could be, in this thought example, or in real cases, be underage. I think that's an interesting philosophical move, because I think the first thing that people who would challenge this would probably draw on is that we have two children's welfare to compare here, right? The child that is pregnant and the child that whose right to life is violated. If I had to play devil's advocate for the position there, I think what someone defending this would point to next is the usual distinction between killing and letting die, right?
Yeah.
So the organ transplant case is an active decision, and we just sort of I mean, the paradigm is you just let nature or life take its course, right? By the person that needs the transplant or the child that needs the transplant dies, and that is regretful, but we can't experiment with another child's body just to prevent this. But they would probably point out that in this particular, like, for the abortion is an active decision, whereas the giving birth is also letting nature take its course. Mm-hmm. And of course, there is a strong risk. I mean, you listed all of these medical details, like how much this will affect the body and other like sort of standards of quality of life. But all of this is, of course, only a risk. It's not guaranteed, right? And even if it were guaranteed to occur, we'd still be taking an active decision rather than just sort of letting things happen as they did without a human intervention. So I was wondering what you would reply to this. There seems to be a difference here, metaphysically or structurally, in terms of decision-making, one being an active action and the other an omission, basically.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Right, so just on your starting point, that what's striking in this analogy is in the living organ donation case, we have 2 children. So, one might say that given what the judges say in Dobbs, I actually don't have analogous cases here because the judges profess in Dobbs to be agnostic about the moral status of the fetus. But what's very useful is, in the organ donation case, we have 2 parties, they have equal moral status, and we know that's what's coming down the pipeline, right? So the notion of fetal personhood is very much being pushed in the United States right now. So let's sort of grant them as being analogous. So we have 2 parties with moral status in both cases. And then we get the challenge, right, well, in the case of a donation, doctors have to actively do something. In the case of pregnancy, they, their hands are clean in a way. It's nature's course. I'd have to intervene. And then I've acted wrongly. So I think what we need to remember in the case of children, that act-omission distinction becomes extremely blurry and in fact disappears. So if I'm a parent and there's a baby in my custody and I watch the baby starve, that's not an omission in a simple sense. I don't get off the hook. That's actually going to be worse than my pinching the baby, right? So my refraining to act when I have a being in my care who cannot attend to their own well-being, who is wholly dependent on me, this negative-positive distinction loses its moral purchase. So we might still sort of, in technical description of my conduct, want to say, there I've acted, here I've done nothing. But in terms of the moral significance, my starving a baby is worse than my actively, So that would be my first response, that doctors would be deluded to say, well, okay, I just didn't act in the case of the pregnancy, right? And my duties were different. We have a duty of care in relation to any child that brings this under the same moral umbrella. The other thing I'd want to say in relation to, you're contrasting sort of the risks of pregnancy versus a guarantee of harm. In the child organ donation case, that's their standard. Is there minimal risk, right? So it could well be they won't proceed in what could have turned out to be a case where no harm was done. But because there was a non-minimal risk, they couldn't proceed. So in the case of pregnancy as well, what's the story about risk? Not, have we got a guarantee of harm? Yeah, thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks very much for the talk. As with Katerina, I was alarmed at some of the data. And I imagine that on the vast majority of actual cases, I would agree with the views you're proposing. But I'm interested in some of the more marginal cases, and in particular, whether you've thought about, instead of trying to come up with the right conception of child, or working with analogies and our intuitions about analogous cases, trying to uncover what the actual wrong-making conditions are of permitting a child to carry through with the pregnancy, for 2 reasons, I guess. I mean, one is, it seems like the conceptions of child are so they're so loaded already. They're so various and they're so loaded with biases, and you might benefit from just coming up with a conception that's particular to your project, that's defined in terms of the wrong-making conditions of, with a normatively thick conception of child. So we don't need something off the shelf and then figure out, cases in which it doesn't quite apply, but just start from the ground up, looking for the wrong-making conditions and define child, or whatever term you use in those terms. And then also, I wonder if it would help with, surely there are going to be some marginal cases where it's a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old, and the case unfolds in a way where a lot of people who are otherwise on your side would say, this one's a little less clear. I mean, there's some serious concerns about unacceptable violations of autonomy here. And to really investigate that side of the story, you would get into looking in more detail at what the wrong-making conditions are.
Yeah.
And then, again, we're probably talking about a very small number of marginal cases here, but yeah.
Thank you. So, yeah, I like the direction you're suggesting I go. What I would hope to do, and I don't know that I need to maybe write a new paper to do this, but just sort of draw more heavily on the philosophy of childhood literature to make this case. I would want to stress that every person has a right to a certain number of burden-free years. And so sort of irrespective of their competency, their development, their puberty, we all should have that right. And in fact, it's a mandatory right. So in the same way that a right to basic education is a mandatory right, we're not permitted to opt out of it. So too, I would want to argue a right to a childhood is a mandatory right. Now, sort of how many years, right? The goods, the greats of childhood, how many years? And I think maybe what's striking is that the goods of younger childhood are possibly quite distinctive from the goods of early adolescence. So in younger childhood, they are the philosophers. There's a lovely quote, I'm afraid I'm going to forget who said it, that philosophy is asking questions that come naturally to 5-year-olds with techniques that come naturally to lawyers. But the questions, right, that's what 5-year-olds, they're the philosophers. Artistic, curious, joyful. So many of the goods I cited are really, paradigmatically the goods of younger childhood. The goods of adolescence, someone's engaging in identity formation, right? That's when we turn more toward our peers rather than our families for our sense of who we are. Who's my community? With whom do I identify? What is my sense of self? And so I would say those goods are equally important to be protected, and those goods are going to be at risk, or a very different identity is going to be taken on if someone gestates. And then even if they don't mother, just the reality of having given birth and then had to make the horrific choice not to parent your child, right? To give your child up for adoption, or indeed to parent your child, and there's work on what it's like. There's a book, Andrew Solomon, Far from the Tree, about parents who become parents as a result of rape, and how this child's presence is a reminder of the trauma that you endured. So the social stigma around a child born as a result of rape. So I think there's a lot to be said about what someone is undergoing in terms of their identity formation, if gestation and birth and then potentially mothering is going to be part of that formation. But with respect to your point about autonomy, that is also relevant to this story. I guess the question is, are we actually honoring someone's autonomy and fostering someone's autonomy by deferring to this preference in this moment? or are we in fact curtailing a lot of autonomy going forward if we privilege this choice? But I think the other thing your question pushes is it sort of brings to the surface the vulnerability in an argument by analogy. So I'm hoping our child living organ donation case is grounded, is solid. The arguments are sufficiently credible that I can then show you why we should think of this case as analogous. But the vulnerability in that kind of argument is, you might be prompted to, well, why not 15 to donate? Why not 14 in some cases? I might be wobbling my reference case rather than convincing you to join me in the analogy. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much for the talk. Really interesting. So this is kind of a follow-up also about the conditions, and I'm wondering what the wrong is and how far the wrong in being bereft of the carefree or the burden-free years is mostly a bodily harm or mostly a psychological harm. Of course, there is a lot of bodily harm in forcing someone or not allowing someone to abort or just maybe even accepting their decision to do that. But it seemed to me that you're also talking about the mental harm of having to be a parent. Now, if that is the case, then one can wonder about what are the conditions for boys. I give you a case. The case is kind of outlandish, but just follow me. We're philosophers, we can have outlandish cases. So 14-year-old kind of has, kind of falls quickly in love with a 25-year-old woman. She isn't really into him, but they're at a party is good, they have sex. She gets pregnant. A week after that, it becomes clear that she's pregnant. The 14-year-old boy says, I didn't really want that, and I want my years of burdenlessness. So I don't want this pregnancy, I do not want to become a father. I have a right to my years of burdenlessness, so I have a right not to be a father. Can we force the 25-year-old woman to abort the baby?
No. What I think a boy has a right to is to say, I have a right to my childhood. I have a right not to parent. So I have a right not to be somehow recruited for parental payments. I have a right not to be allocated custody. Or I have a right to have an independent advocate represent me or sort of arrange for me at what point and in what ways I will be involved as I mature. But no, bodily autonomy means no one gets to tell a woman to have an abortion. But your point speaks to my focus on girlism. There is an analogous concept of boyism, which I haven't explored. And I do wish there were a gender-neutral term that captured the injustices we endure at the intersection of our gender and youth. My doctoral student and I, we were reaching into our Latin to try to land on a term, but there wasn't, maybe someone can offer me one, but we did not find one that was going to wear the injustice on its face, right? We wanted a term that would declare what we were talking about, and you wouldn't have to go and check, what does this word mean? But maybe we need to just work harder and popularize it such that it's known what it means. Misogyny, the first time that was coined, what on earth is that person talking about? And we then kind of figure it out. But no, boyism, I think the types of injustices that would go under that heading, many of them would relate to sort of capitalizing on many boys' inclinations to glorify war, right? So there are age limits, minimum age limits to be recruited as a soldier. But in times of war, that age limit is often ignored, and boys who should still be allowed to be children are then made cannon fodder because they think this is going to be glorious. Child soldiers, most of them are boys, and they're extremely aggressive, and you cannot treat them like children because of the brutality they've endured, and they've been robbed of that protective time of childhood, and it's because they're boys that they were robbed in that way. So there's definitely an analogous story of injustice to be told here. I think I wanted to say one other thing. Right, you were talking about bodily wrongs versus psychic wrongs or psychological harms. There's so many distressing cases. I think we just have to acknowledge that this is upsetting territory, that the people in this situation are in a tragic situation. The youngest person to give birth in the UK, Tressa Middleton, was 12, the youngest person on record, and she had been raped by her brother and gave birth, and the baby was taken away from her. And she wrote a memoir about this where she expressed deep regret that she was not allowed to be part of raising her baby. She was on drugs. She was in an extremely difficult situation. It was for the sake of her baby that the baby was taken away. So I don't know that we can really separate bodily harms from psychological harm. So there's so much trauma in that story, and sort of if it goes all the way to giving birth, and then we compound the tragedy of that 12-year-old. And I think Elizabeth Harmon, in her UHERA lectures last year, she talked about sort of the prospect of love that certainly women and possibly older teens know they're going to feel, right? They don't yet love what's going on in their bodies, but they know they're going to feel very strongly about a baby that they give birth to. And she says it's actually because of that anticipated love that people need to be provided abortion care when it's right for them. I think she does reference Justice Amy Coney Barrett in her lectures, because what was so striking during the oral arguments ahead of the Dobbs judgment was that Justice Coney Barrett asked the government's representatives, well, what about these safe haven laws where you can just drop the baby off in a box at a police office, right? And then why do we need to provide abortion care? Just make it the case people can wash their hands once they've given birth. And liberal commentators and feminists were just stunned at this view of a woman who herself has several children, that someone could give birth and just dispassionately hand it away. So I think the bodily and the psychic are very much intertwined in this story.
Thank you so much for a wonderful and thought-provoking talk. I was happy to hear that you were rethinking the name just a moment ago, and I have a proposal other than girlism. I mean, one of the disadvantages of girlism is that we use it for all kinds of things. You introduced it by way of analogy with speciesism or racism or sexism and so on, and that's good, but we also use it in lots of other ways, nationalism, fanaticism, and so on and so on. And then you just a moment ago mentioned misogyny, and why not form it in analogy with that? Kore is ancient Greek for girl, and so you would say misogyny or something like that, right?
I couldn't say it.
Neither can I.
I had the term, and I was practicing saying it. And the other reason I didn't go for, I think I had misochoristry. But the reason I didn't use it was because it was partly in deference to Kate Mann, who's drawn a useful distinction between misogyny and sexism. And so I thought, okay, maybe we want to hang on to that Greek derivation for the business of policing sexism against girls. And then the other reason I didn't go for it was I really hoped I really wanted a gender-neutral term if I could find one, but as I say, I haven't managed so far. But I think I've interrupted you.
No, that's okay. I just also wanted to ask a question, but you could go for the ancient Greek word for child if you wanted to also cover what you just a moment ago called boyism.
Okay, so, but that was just a proposal, and and the question I have is a footnote to the earlier question about autonomy and wrong-making conditions and so on, and that's just to say, how flexible are you on defining what a child is? You let out various conditions earlier, and you weren't quite happy with any single one of them, and so I wasn't quite sure where you landed there, but it seemed to me that you were rather flexible, say, oh, it depends on circumstances. So if you have a case of a 17-year-old who is pregnant and really wants the baby and really doesn't want an abortion, and there are good other circumstances perhaps in place, guardians and so on are in favor, the circumstances are relatively secure financially and so on, then maybe you would say, okay, it's not that I'm not applying my other criteria for the problem here. It's just that I'm saying that this is no longer a child for these, under these circumstances, under these conditions.
Right.
So it's a question of how flexible you are. You could then still say, yeah, but nothing under 15 or 16 or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's right. So I think, certainly if the aim would be to advise physicians or to advise lawmakers or even have better laws in the books, we would have to be arbitrary. We would have to say, for under 16, just taking organ donation as our model, this would be the case. Adequate care includes abortion care. For 16 to 18, we'll grant that as a space in which autonomy is developing. And then we need an independent advocate to be in conversation with this minor to determine how well informed she is and so on. So there's the mature minor, that is sort of a well-established notion in medical practice, and certain conditions have to be met to display the competence, that you're aware of the ramifications of your choice, and that you're fully informed of what you're accepting or refusing. I think possibly in the case of pregnancy, we would want to add a few more conditions, not just demonstration of maturity, for a few reasons. One, girls' brains myelinate sooner than boys do. So they prune themselves, they trim themselves, they get ready for adulthood quicker. And so girls display maturity faster, which then sort of sets them up to be robbed of final years of childhood more readily, right? So, who do we recruit to be our babysitters? Who is tasked with caring for older family members? There was a study done in the UK of how much it would cost to replace the unpaid work that teenagers do in their families. And it was in the billions, right? In terms of preparing meals, educating younger siblings, caring for older adults. But there's a gender imbalance in that work. Most of that work is being done by our teenage girls. So I think there's a bullet to be bitten here, and it's, in a way, you want to honor someone who is demonstrating competence, who has the capacity to express their preferences, who's displaying autonomy, but given how it tends to go in terms of development, the people showing those things are going to be girls, and they're going to be robbed of their childhood more quickly. And I think maybe some of the other conditions, as were the ones you listed, is this a financially secure position? Does she have good support in her family? The people who are most vulnerable going in are those who are already in poverty, right? It's not generic and uniform across demographics of girls who is going to find themselves in this situation. So the girl for whom we might say, okay, yes, we can clearly defer to her preferences, certain things will have to be true of her that are not true of the majority of people who are going to find themselves in this position. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for this talk. One thing that keeps on coming up at the core of it and in the discussion, I think, is the notion of the right to childhood, which has been very strong. So I had a couple of remarks around that. One was just noting that I think in the responses so far, maybe it was to Matt's question, you did seem to note that the right to childhood, in principle, would be violated intrinsically if you have a child yourself, which in some ways is in a curious tension with your rightful critique of the view of a sort of an instantaneous transition to womanhood if you give birth.
Right. Yeah.
Put that to the side for a moment, but thinking about the right to childhood and what it's a right to in the bullet point list that you gave, when you offered that, it made me think about how historically and regionally and geographically contingent that kind of childhood status has been.
Right.
And on the other hand, it led me immediately to think of a very important moment in history when labor laws come into place protecting children from being forced to labor or being allowed to labor, although that's also being eroded in the country to the south at least. So, I wanted to note that as maybe another resource other than organ donation, like an intuition that in virtue of a right to childhood, then certain practices that would be possibly compelled upon other sorts of people are barred, and there are reasons for that. Also, I think there's some people now who are quite concerned about the effects of social media and are noting that child labor laws are protections there.
Yeah. Great.
But this also led me to think the pubescence. So you were talking about pubescence as a criterion in the biological sense. And there's something else about the right to childhood and so on that's related to this. And I'm just going to draw on some remarks that Merleau-Ponty makes about pubescence in a set of hard to decipher lectures called the Institution Lectures. But it's basically the interesting point. It relates to your point about futurity, where he's talking about pubescence as a transition to engagement with erotic life. And he's talking about the prepubescent person as somebody who sort of understands that there's this domain of erotic behavior, but they also, for themselves and for people looking at them, they don't really understand what's involved or how to negotiate it. So this is sort of the point that somebody in this position of being a prepubescent in the psychological sense is aware that there's a domain of decision-making in which they don't quite have capacity. And somehow that connects up with the labor law thing. And we do have laws and strong senses of preclusions of certain kinds of engagement with children below a certain age around the erotic because they're not capable of that. So I'm just wondering about that as, couldn't something like that be a criterion for circling in around these questions around the right to childhood? Like there's certain decisions that it just doesn't seem that one is now capable of making about these sorts of things because the meaning domain, the hermeneutical domain just isn't available to you. Like seems clear in the erotic sense.
Yeah, no, thank you. That last one's that's very important. I've been listening to Maya Angelou read her memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And in chapters 11 to 13, she tells of her experience of being sexually abused by her mother's boyfriend, and then raped by him. It doesn't result in pregnancy, but the way she tells it, and of course she's writing this as an adult, trying to recapture her thoughts as a child. But the thoughts she had as a child were, initially when he held her in his arms, she felt comforted. She got to hear the beat of his heart. She obviously hadn't been held much as a child, and she really felt loved and treasured and sought this closeness. And then during sort of the first instance of sexual abuse, she'd had a nightmare. She climbed in bed next to her mom. Her mom left early to go to work. And then during the course of the abuse, he said to her, "Oh, you've wet the bed." And she said, "No, I didn't." But that was the concept she had, right? That she had wet the bed. And so she just presents this as a child, how so much is lacking, no understanding of what's being done to her and what's going on. And then after the rape, he says to her, if you tell anyone, I will have to kill your brother. And she's trying to connect this. Why? What's the? And still doesn't understand what's been done to her, what she's endured. And so, a teenager is very differently placed, but not always better informed, right? There was a member of the House of Congress. She gave testimony prior to the Dobbs judgment, how she was 16, she'd gone to a Catholic girls' school, she didn't know how someone came to be pregnant, and then discovered that she was. This was pre-Roe. Her mom had to take her to Mexico, sort of side alley abortion. So there's definitely, the concepts that our sort of bodies can make sense of are different when we're young from when we're teenagers, but our level of ignorance it depends on how we're treated. It depends on how our adults support us. With respect to your first point, that so the idea of being robbed of childhood might be in tension with my critique of the transformative nature of pregnancy. So, to my mind, those are talking about two different things. That in the case of the sort of the transformative story, what seems to be presented in the literature, certainly the UN talking about 15 to 19-year-old women and early childbearing, is that somehow miraculously you acquire competence, right? That you suddenly, just mothering matures you. Mothering might force you into survival mode. Mothering you might suddenly be, you are going to be transformed, but it would be mistaken to think that suddenly you magically become mature and competent. And then what you've been robbed of is so much, that protective space of burden-freeness, the potential to develop a different identity, your identity as someone who has not undergone that transformation, an acknowledgement of what's actually happened to your identity. So I don't see them as intention, but clearly I need to be more careful about the way in which you're transformed and what you've been robbed of. Yeah. And I appreciate the point about the history of childhood. That the concept of childhood is not something we've always acknowledged. In the past, we might have just thought of these as short people who could be deployed. That childhood is something we've come to recognize as a stage of life in the same way we've come to recognize that women are persons, right? That we're hopefully making progress, moral progress. But there are some dots I want to connect in relation to, as you say, labor laws, social media, the way we might be eroding some of that protection of that stage. Thank you.
Hi. So I was wondering, you believe that children have the right to be burden-free for a certain amount of time, correct? So I'm just curious, do we owe a girl who, after she's had an abortion, forcibly or not, to deal with the trauma of basically losing that time that should have been burden-free?
What do we owe her? Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's a really good question, because we can't assume it away, right? We can, during the course of her treatment, be very careful in how we present her condition to her, right? So, certainly not speak in the language of, you're having a baby, and maybe not even say that this is an intrauterine gestation. Like that is the striking language that doctors are given in their guidance on how to engage with a minor. Someone who is detected to have an intrauterine gestation should be offered, all three options of abortion, adoption, or raising a child. I think in the same, we might even think of impregnation, certainly in young childhood, that is at the very least statutory rape, but impregnation in young childhood could be likened to a sexually transmitted disease, right? This is a malady. This is something that someone has done to this person. They have injured this person, grossly violated this person. And that should inform the language we use to talk about their care. And certainly being careful to ensure our language doesn't imply any responsibility on their part for what they endured or what choices now have to be made. And then after, because the body takes a while to heal, again, sort of this is an illness. And then sort of as the child gets older, sort of then that's the time to talk about everything that happened. When they have concepts, when they can make sense of their experience. Yeah, but no, it's a very good question. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I have a couple of questions about the list of goods that you talk about in relation to childhood. So a lot of those things seem like things that adults might also value. Like it might be, I think most people in this room probably think that being philosophically curious is like something valuable and a good for them. And it seems intuitive that maybe there's a reason why children should be entitled to these things and adults maybe don't have those same sort of entitlements. But I was wondering if you could explain why you think that is the case. And the second thing is when you say that children have a right to a certain number of years to be unburdened, what exactly does it mean to be unburdened? Because it seems that especially in early adolescence, part of early adolescence is A, filled with very many burdens, but B, it's about learning how to weather and undergo those burdens and to deal with them in ways that are positive. So yeah, those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So the philosophy of childhood, there's an interesting debate about how to think about children. Are they caterpillars that are going to grow into butterflies? Are they saplings that are going to grow into bigger trees? Are they defective adults? Are we defective children? These are the kinds of arguments that are being had. And I think the central claim of someone like Anke Gausch is children are particularly good at philosophical curiosity, artistic expression, creativity, innovation. Like children are thoughtlessly disobedient, right? A child will play the piano with their feet, they'll walk across the chairs, they'll go down the stairs on their bottom, and we're all kind of, yeah, I guess that's okay. So it's, there's a glory in that not knowing the rules and not really caring about the rules. And then when we move into adulthood, we have to work hard to hang on to those skills, right? Philosophical curiosity is not the mindset of most adults. And it's sort of a skill we train over 4 years of an undergraduate or 10 years, including graduate school, to keep being comfortable with disagreement, being interested in different questions, being happy, being unsettled. So, I guess your thought is, do we not all have a right sort of to enjoy these goods? Adults, we have more options to try and get them for ourselves. Or we certainly should. Our society should support us in trying to retain our artistic creativity or cultivate our philosophical curiosity. Children, they are not in control of whether they get to have those options, keep those options, have them be nurtured and supported. And because they're such great goods, they need to be protected in childhood. With respect to your second point about life or death, or about being unburdened, I think my note I've made for myself is this sort of life or death questions. So, yes, we want children to grow in independence. There's a lot of work in psychology now that says one way to mitigate the high levels of anxiety in children is to give them independence. That you don't need to actually do exposure therapy to the thing that's frightening someone, just giving someone more independence, get yourself to school, get yourself home, that actually can help to mitigate anxieties. But the kinds of burdens that are implicated in gestation and parenting, those are life and death burdens. If you've held a newborn, it is a frightening experience that they need you. You cannot go away, and you start to actually concern yourself about your own safety because they need you. So that incredible, startling, panic-inducing responsibility to keep someone alive, to care for someone, to make a decision about whether to try to sustain a life or not, that is the type of burden I have in mind. So I'm absolutely on board with us growing into responsibility and assuming burdens. And many children, they have no choice but to grow up in a setting of extreme burdensomeness. Any child growing up in a war zone is burdened in a way children should not be burdened. But where we have a choice to protect a child from life and death burdens, we owe it to them.
Thank you so much for your great presentation. I just have a point that pretty much overlapped with the last question about burden, but I want to ask it from a different direction. I find the term girlism is very interesting by describing a specific social injustice. So I remembered you comparing it with racism or sexism or anti-Semitism. And in those, for example, racism, we can easily find two subjects. One is the racist, another side is the oppressed race or discriminated race. And I find in girlism is a little bit different. So firstly, we want to find a girlist. Okay, we can broadly describe it as a group who targeted on girl or who actually done the harm to girls. And we also have a oppressed group, a targeted group, or as mistreated girls. But the difference I find is in a very typical and traditional colonialism propaganda, there's white man's burden, which means there is a superior race who take the burden from the inferior race. And in taking care of children, of course, we want children to be burden-free. So could you please explain a little bit more among this difference of these social injustice?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I'll say a couple things about why girlism is not a perfect term, in addition to some things I've said before. One is that we use isms to pick out types of injustice, but we also use isms in a celebratory way. Liberalism, feminism, right? Communitarianism, egalitarianism. Ism does different kinds of work in English. And indeed, one might wish to hang on to the term girlism for something celebratory, right? That a girlist act was actually an affirmative, supportive act, yeah, that did well by girls. So I think some of the difficulty is this term is not yet in circulation. I'll have done my work well if it ever becomes in circulation or some similar term gains traction. But I think some of our sort of sense of weirdness about it might be that it's not yet we aren't yet deploying it. With respect to sort of, how do we position this in a way we might speak about racism? So, there are debates about whether racism, and sexism, whether it's, okay, this person is racist, this person is sexist, or this system is racist, this system is sexist. If it's about persons, any person is capable of sexism, right? There's lots of evidence of how sexist women are against women. So I don't think we then need to kind of find that positioning. Nonetheless, I hear what you're saying, that we have another term in relation to racism when we want to imply there's racism against Caucasian people, reverse racism. It's sort of taken as given that when we use the term racism, we're not meaning against white people. And so I think you're saying that just as there's sort of those connotations in racism, that there's an ostensibly superior race and then those who are subordinated or oppressed, what's the analog in the case of girls? Because we want girls to be protected when they're children. We want them to be, quote unquote, be superior people who are making decisions on their behalf. I don't know that I really have a difficulty. Because the sort of the function of these terms is to track injustices, and there are so many ways we can carve up the territory, right? And sort of the history of an assertion of a superior sex, we're undoing that in our discussions about sexism. And even though we want to acknowledge that adults and children are differently placed, it would be very poor reasoning to suggest that adults are superior. I find that people in philosophy of childhood literature who talk about children as defective adults, I find that wholly pernicious. Just as someone who talks about not having children as being child-free, that's a really offensive way to say you don't have children. Being childless is also disparaging to someone who doesn't have children. We should just use a few more words. This is someone who doesn't have a child. But I maybe need to do a bit more work here to show that I've still got a good ism, even though it doesn't look quite like the other ones we usually work with. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I found all the points that you made really compelling, and like other people have voiced, I didn't realize the prevalence of pregnancy among girls. I was interested in the language that you were talking about of kind of talking about this as, like talking about these girls as something has been done to them, and the shift from using like, impregnated child rather than pregnant child. I was just wondering if I'm trying to like anticipate backlash of how you would respond to possible objections to this in a case of that's not one of sexual assault, such as like a consensual sexual relationship between two teenagers, for example, and how that might factor into like the sense of treating the pregnancy as a malady and as like an impregnated person.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the Romeo and Juliet type case. It's more the exception than the norm. And the language of impregnation is meant to really underscore that the person, the child who is gestating, did not choose this, right? May have had no idea how this happens. Now, in the case of, if we have sort of 14-year-old Romeo and Juliet, maybe Romeo also did not know how pregnancy happens. And so, to say so-and-so impregnated so-and-so, implies accountability. So I want to clarify that. So the reason I actually latched on this language of impregnation was as a result of reading one of the Russian skaters in the Olympics a couple years ago. She won the gold medal, and then she lost it because she failed a drug test. And what was stressed was that she was sort of 15 going on 16 when she won. And so instead of all this nefarious reporting about her vice, it should have been acknowledged that this was something her coaches did to her. And so it was the effort was to counteract the UN language, early childbearing of women 15 to 19. Like to really stress this is not someone who was sort of negligent in their sexual behavior, or who actively sought to be pregnant and then changed their mind, or the people who oppose abortion, sort of their image of someone seeking abortion is that they're seeking it as contraception, that they're being callous and cavalier about this. Whereas the person at the heart of my story, she did not choose. This has been done to her. But I certainly would want to exonerate anyone like a Romeo, that's, he too is a child, right, in this story. Still, it is as a result of their coupling, that he has done something to her, sort of in the way that, a child who has COVID can cough on another child and transfer the virus. But I would not want to then imply accountability to him.
Do we have any other questions?
Thank you very much. Are we doing one more? One more. Last one.
I just have a quick one. Thank you for the lecture. So thinking about this and the thinking of children as agents or not, what kind of difference do they have with regards to adults that, bear in this kind of discussion? I was wondering, and I don't think this is comparable, but I think if there's this case that we could maybe think of, which may offer some insights or some trajectories to follow along, and it's the case of women who are in a coma and happen to become victims of rape and become pregnant. And yeah, I was wondering if we could think along with that and see what happens.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a helpful case, because so cases like that show the extremity of an abortion ban, right? That someone in that position, or even someone drugged, someone drunk, anyone who's just treated as a body, is violated as a body and then becomes a vessel for another life, and their own personhood is disregarded. Another case, and you're often almost sickened having to give these cases to show the extremity of the position. But because this legislation defines a woman as any human being with a uterus, a newborn baby who is female is a human being with a uterus. And so someone opposed to abortion, they can kind of breathe a small sigh of relief that infants cannot be impregnated. But the youngest person who's given birth was 5. That somehow you are of ultimate value, fetal personhood, the sanctity of life, you're of ultimate precious value before you're born. And then once you're born, if you're female, you are an instrument, you're a disposable vessel for future ultimate value, the sanctity of life. So it's just a reductio ad absurdum of that stance. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Are we good? Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate your comments.
Any last words from Anna or David? No? That's great. Okay, Kimberley, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming in. Thank you for your questions. Just going to let you know, for people joining us online, we'll be closing up the Zoom and the live stream now, but this conversation remains available on our YouTube channel, and you should revisit it. That's enough from me. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again.